no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on. Call in now. 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories,
Your freedom.
the Peter Schiff Show.
Welcome, everybody, to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods, in for Peter. Hope you'll join us for the next 2 hours. I've corralled 2 more good guests for us to talk to, smash the conventional wisdom, and there is so much to be smashed and only 2 hours a day in which to do it. Frustrating, but we're going to make the most out of these 2 hours. The bottom of the hour, we're going to talk to a hero of mine, Lewis Fisher. Now, if you haven't heard of Lewis Fisher, he is the foremost authority in the U.S. on the subject of presidential war powers under the Constitution. We're going to talk about Obama and Leon Panetta and the attitude of, well, you know what, we may go bomb somebody, and then we'll be courteous enough to come to Congress and let you know what we've been up to. Well, thanks. That's real sweet there, Leon. You're a real sport. So we're going to talk to Lewis Fisher, who's going to answer the same things that are said over and over again by every freaking president, one after the other. They all say the same thing. And the fact that they all make the same bogus arguments is then used to justify the bogus arguments. Well, look, my predecessor made the same bogus argument I'm making. And the guy before him and the one before him, so how could we all be wrong? Yeah, how could all these people be? Could you imagine the possibility that our presidents may be wrong on something? I hate to make your head explode this hour of the morning. All right, that's the first guest. Then the second guest, we're going to be joined by Gary Taubes, who's a nutrition expert in general health. And he's going to talk about this new study that we just saw linked yesterday on Drudge, telling us that the consumption of red meat is responsible for something like 1 in 10 early deaths. Is that true? Is that really true? You can't eat that steak anymore? You got to stay away from it? Should be eating a loaf of bread instead? Like, what is really going on? Is there any merit to this study? So Gary Taubes will be joining us. Always welcome your questions to make this conversation more interesting, and you can submit them. You can talk to us here at 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. Now, we've just gotten some election results, some more primary results. Ron Paul did not contest the Deep South states of Alabama and Mississippi. And there, the people there just voted overwhelmingly in numbers that indicate that, I'm surprised at this, that the Deep South basically is pretty confident about the direction of the country right now. I was under the impression that they thought we were on the wrong track, but overwhelmingly they're voting for candidates who are going to change things 1.2%. So apparently, in spite of all their complaints about the direction of the country under Obama, they're basically happy. Apparently, according to their votes anyway, they're basically happy. They don't want somebody who's going to not engage in bailouts, or who's seriously going to challenge the Federal Reserve, or who might change the foreign policy fiasco that seems to encourage Islamic extremism everywhere it touches, or who might actually do something about taxes, or who actually has a plan to reduce spending. I don't see any specifics on spending from any of these people. Who might keep education at the local level instead of continuously centralizing it. I mean, you just keep going on and on and on. Apparently, they like all these policies. The only conclusion I can draw. That's what they're voting for. They're voting for these policies. Well, Chris Matthews of MSNBC, he's your analyst you go to, right, when you want to understand the world. Here's Chris Matthews trying to understand why Mitt Romney is not picking up steam in the Deep South. He's stuck in the 20%, and he's having trouble breaking through. Now, it could be that Romney's just obviously a fake. Like, even for voters who are too establishment to think of voting for Ron Paul, he's too fake even for them. Like, his every move seems scripted and robotic, and maybe that's the problem. Just the other day, Business Insider reported that the Romney campaign said that, hey, it's Mitt's birthday coming up. Everybody send him a birthday tweet. Happy birthday, Mitt. And I forget how long it had been, like a day. I think it was like maybe it might have been a full day. He'd gotten 68 tweets wishing him happy birthday. I mean, I think that says something. Like, people are not connecting with this guy. He's too fake. He's willing to be whatever you want him to be. You want him to be a warmonger, then that's what he's going to be. You want him to put up that fence, then he's going to put up that whatever it is you want him to be, he's going to be. But I want you to hear, this is Obama's explanation. Pardon me. Well, the Freudian slip there, right? Here's Chris Matthews' explanation for why Romney is having trouble cracking this magic number in high 20s or much beyond that. Let's go to cut number 1, please.
Yeah, I think religion matters. I mean, Reverend Allen, you, Ed, and I all know the way that the people in these polls down there have said they think the president is a Muslim. I mean, a majority in one of those states thinks he is, and the other 30-some% say they don't know. In other words, they say they don't know whether he's lying about his religion, which is a pretty strong indictment right there. So culturally, they're out to lunch for the president. They're not going to vote for President Obama. So who are they going to get to beat him? That's what seems to be on their minds down there. Now, who do they like? They're willing to outsource it to a Mormon. It seems to me if they can win, I said it's almost like calling up India or somewhere in the third world to get your computer fixed. You don't care who's fixing it; just fix the damn computer.
All right, let's juxtapose that. Let's go on ahead to cut number 3 and listen to further commentary from Chris Matthews, and then you get a little commentary from me.
There's a pattern that's emerged here tonight. We pointed out earlier, Romney can't seem to break, whether it's his LDS religion or his Northern money. Look at these numbers. We should show them again. Look at that. We got him in green starting out there, 28%, 26%, 28, 20. He can't break high 20s in Dixie.
All right, so it's got to be that he's a Mormon or that he's got Northern money. Now, either of those is a possibility. I'm sure, some people who won't vote for him because he's a Mormon. That's certainly true. I'm sure there are some people who won't vote for him because they're afraid of what the sources of his income are. But, well, it's not like the other candidates have got a whole lot to top him with there. Like, they're all being bankrolled by sinister, shady characters. Like, they all are. So it's impossible for Chris Matthews to suppose that people are just turned off by a guy who is, even by political standards, fake. Even by political standards, is a mannequin, a plastic man who just can't be believed. And who, as soon as he gets the nomination, then he'll spend the rest of the time crisscrossing the country, pretending he didn't say the things he obviously did say during the campaign. You think he won't do that? Just go to YouTube, type in Mitt Romney, and you're going to see all these videos of him denying having said things that you just saw in the previous clip he said. Maybe people don't like that. So if they don't like Romney, that's at least step 1. At least they got some kind of thinking apparatus. But this idea that Matthews has, that he also goes on to say later in his commentary, is that people are looking for somebody who can beat Obama, and so the people who are supporting Romney in the South are voting for him quite in spite of his religion, which they very much don't like, he says, and they're voting for him even though they don't like him because they dislike Obama worse. But the question is, how electable is a guy who gets 68 birthday tweets? He has no connection with the public. It's a losing strategy even on its own terms. All right, we got more to say about this and much more. We're going to play that awful Leon Panetta clip and bash it to smithereens. All right, you're listening to the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. Join me, 855-4-SCHIFF. Coming right back.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
All right, everybody, we are back here on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. And I want to immediately go to the soundboard here and play you a couple of excerpts. And now, some of you astute Internet people, politically aware, may already have heard this, but it can't be played frequently enough, in my opinion, because I want to make some initial commentary on it. But really what I want to do is set up the opportunity. I want to get the softball, meatball over the plate for our first guest today. Will be coming on at the bottom of the hour. And I'm so excited to talk to Louis Fisher. I've never met him. I've never spoken to him. But he's somebody I've admired from a scholarly standpoint for many years, and he is very, very good at dealing with issues like this. And I don't want to take our time with him playing this. Let's play it now. So what we're going to hear right now is Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, who I think, wasn't he the Transportation Secretary at one point? So this guy's just a jack of all trades. Whatever you need him to do, he'll do. And I guess he figures, I become Defense Secretary and I don't rock the boat, I have got a very, very lucrative contract waiting for me somewhere in the military-industrial complex when I get out. That is how it always works. So he's lining up. Works better than the contracts you get in the transportation department. How'd you like to run the New York subway system after you retire? Forget that. So here's Panetta talking before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he's being grilled by Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama. So let's listen to cut number 5.
When it comes to the kind of military action where we want to build a coalition and work with our international partners, then obviously we would like to have some kind of legal basis on which to do it, as we did in Libya.
Now, some sort of legal basis. We worried about international legal basis, but nobody worried about the fundamental constitutional legal basis that this Congress has over war. We were not asked, stunningly, in direct violation of the War Powers Act, whether or not you believe it's Constitution. It certainly didn't comply with it. We spent our time worrying about the UN, the Arab League, NATO, and too little time, in my opinion, worried about the elected representatives of the United States.
All right, perfectly good objection from Senator Sessions. Let's go to cut 6, where it gets even worse.
Do you think that you can act without Congress and initiate a no-fly zone in Syria without congressional approval?
You know, again, our goal would be to seek international permission, and we would come to the Congress and inform you and determine how best to approach this, whether or not we would want to get permission from the Congress. I think those are issues we would have to discuss as we decide what to do here.
Well, I'm almost breathless about that, because what I heard you say is we're going to seek international approval, and then we'll come and tell the Congress what we might do, and we might seek congressional approval.
All right, everybody, I'm going to translate for you what Panetta just said, but I'm going to translate it in a family-friendly way. Because there is an R-rated way I could translate what he's saying, so I'm going to assume there are children in the room. What Panetta's basically saying is you can take your Constitution and shove it. That's our attitude. That's what you can do with your stinking Constitution. And I'm going to say that with my somber expression on my face that all defense secretaries need to have. You need to get that down, make it look like you're so weighed down by terrible responsibilities that it's hard for you even to consider these objections from the proles about their so-called Constitution. Oh, gosh. I'm so burdened by responsibilities, and you people want to live in a free country. Will you quit bothering me with this stuff? If we feel like coming and telling you after the fact what we've already done, then we just might do that. So we'll get the country into a mess and then leave it to the Congress to then pull the plug by withholding funding once we've already committed the troops and the Pandora's box has been opened. I mean, that is in effect what he's saying. So, yeah, we might go and see what the elites elsewhere in the world think about it. We might consider, and even that we don't really care about, frankly. Even that we don't care about. We care about that more than we care about Senator Sessions. All right, so we've got Louis Fisher coming on to talk about this. Is the administration on any kind of reasonable constitutional grounds in taking a position like this? Is this just a lot of nitpicking on the part of regular Americans who are concerned about this? Can they do this in Syria? How did they justify the Libya intervention? Is this all okay? And it's interesting, when the Libya fiasco got started, this was when I wound up having my debate, so-called, with radio host Mark Levin, because he said that the conservative Mark Levin said Obama was absolutely right. Sided with Obama. Obama has every right to intervene in Libya for regime change without consulting Congress. And that was really when I went ahead and showed that was not the case, and then I challenged Levin to a one-on-one debate, and then that was it. And then I never heard from him again. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, in the meantime, we've got a caller I'm going to take. We're not talking about presidential war powers, so we're just going to keep Panetta burning in the back of our minds. Okay, we're just going to keep that thing in there, cultivating it in the back of our minds so that we can come back to it and rip it up by the roots after the break. But let's talk to John in Arlington, Virginia. John, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Thanks, Tom. How are you?
Doing great.
Hey, great show. Great job. I'm a fan of yours and Peter's, and especially the couple shows you did last week were phenomenal.
Thank you.
One quick comment on a topic that you were just talking about, national security. Based on my work in national security for about 10 or 15 years, when it comes to national security, and again, I'm more of a original framers, follow them what they were thinking, but there's a huge hole in the Constitution for the type of national security challenges that were not even envisioned back then. And that's just a general comment. But my question is dealing with, as I go out and try to preach, what you're saying, what Peter says, one of the arguments I get from liberals is regarding the tragedy of the commons. Are you familiar?
Yes, I am.
With that? Yeah, well, the argument is that, if they call it the commons, meaning the meadows, is that if a bunch of sheep farmers all let their sheep overgraze, then eventually the entire commons will be basically overgrazed, overfarmed, and usually this kind of analogy comes up with any kind of finite resources, whether it's overfishing. And the argument that they put, and in political science classes they say, is there is regulation needed because when people act in their own self-interest, eventually, in some scenarios, it will be to the detriment of the entire collective. And I wanted to know what argument you use, or have you used an argument against the tragedy of the commons? What's the answer to the tragedy of the commons? Because one of the other adjuncts you'll hear people say, nobody will build roads. If it came to building roads, nobody wants to build a road. And so that's one of the being able to provision the private sector, the public sector has a need to do that. So that's basically my question. It's not too convoluted.
No, not at all, John. Thanks for the call. Okay, actually, I think there are two questions here. Number one is the tragedy of the commons, and the other one is the provision of public goods in the absence of taxes. And that's a separate issue, and I'll try and do what I can to get to both between now and the bottom of the hour super fast. So the tragedy of the commons, what the classic tragedy of the commons is, you've got some land where animals graze or something, but it's unowned by anybody. It's so-called, that's why we call it the commons. Well, the problem with it is that, you could think of anything. You think of, let's say there's some land where there's some animal that people like to hunt. People like to go deer hunting, let's say, in this particular area, but nobody owns the area. If somebody owned that area, he would not go and kill all the deer because, you'd get a lot of deer in the first year, and then you'd have zero in every subsequent year. When you own something, you want to preserve the capital value of the thing, the long-term life of the thing. But when you don't own it, it doesn't benefit you. In other words, if you owned it, you would restrain yourself from killing every deer. But when it's not owned by anybody, if you restrain yourself from killing every deer, all you're doing is leaving those deer for other people to kill. And so the incentive is for everybody, instead of preserving the stock, the incentive is for everybody to grab the entire stock as quickly as possible to prevent other people from grabbing it. That's what the tragedy of the commons is. And so the answer to that, of course, is just don't have commons. Or if you do, it's got to be under certain circumstances. But for example, you could do what the American Indians used to do. Now, the American Indians were told they didn't know what private property was, and they didn't believe in private property rights. That's just absolutely false, 1,000% false. They assigned hunting rights to particular tribes or clans and family groups, and they would say, you can hunt in this bound-off area, and this family can hunt in this area, and this family can hunt in this area, and that prevented the tragedy of the commons because I have an incentive to preserve the stock of animals in my area. And I can prevent other people from coming in and poaching because it's my private property, so I don't have the tragedy of the commons. Or in the Pacific Northwest, salmon farming. Well, I guess it was fishing at that time, but you can fish in this part, and you can fish in this part, and you can fish in this part, and that prevents overfishing. And then when the white man got rid of the Indians, the white man engaged immediately in overfishing and abandoned these great private property solutions. That's basically the answer. All right, we're coming right back with Louis Fisher on the Peter Schiff Show, 855-4-SCHIFF, 855-472-4433. Stick around.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Now return to the Peter Schiff Show. Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. And right now we have a distinct pleasure, and it's particularly a pleasure of mine because I've learned so much from this gentleman over the years and admired him from a scholarly standpoint. And to have him as a guest is just a great privilege, and I didn't know we were going to be able to work it out, and here he is. Louis Fisher, scholar in residence at the Constitution Project, has taught at many universities, testified dozens and dozens and dozens of times before Congress. His many books include, most importantly, in my opinion, from the point of view of the work that I've been doing, Presidential War Power. And a lot of people have thought of me as being some kind of authority on presidential war power, but I would be more like the shadow, and Lou Fisher would be like the Platonic form when it comes to the study of this stuff. So, Lou Fisher, it's my real pleasure and honor to welcome you to the Peter Schiff Show today.
Thank you so very much. That's the first time I've ever been called a Platonic form. That's a new role for me.
I think it's the first time I've used that analogy. All right, let's jump right in now. Before you came on, I played the segments, which probably you've heard by now, of Leon Panetta talking to Senator Sessions.
Right.
So let's start there. I mean, we can talk about Libya in just a minute, but let's start there. He was claiming two basic things. Number one is, it was without saying it in so many words, he was in effect saying we might consult you after the fact if we feel like doing it, but we don't feel compelled to do it, number one. And secondly, what really matters is that we get some kind of international recognition of what we're doing. Can you take those one at a time for us? Take all the time you need explaining what's wrong with that?
Well, I think what Panetta is doing is got started with President Truman. He was the first president to circumvent Congress. This is June 1950. He circumvented Congress. He went to the UN Security Council for, quote, authority. The Security Council passed 2 resolutions. So that is the first time in our history, after 160 or so years, where a president would totally walk around Congress and go to some outside body, and that's basically what Secretary Panetta is saying here, maybe not the Security Council, but our NATO allies. And after Truman did that in 1950, which was actually against the law, in 1945, when the Senate passed the UN Charter, the United States had to decide how it was going to participate. And the UN Participation Act that year in Section 6 made very clear that any time a president used military force in the UN, it had to come first to Congress to get authority. So 5 years later, Truman violated that law and the constitutional independence. And other presidents have done it as well. The first Bush in 1990 went to the Security Council in November to get, quote, authority to go to war against Iraq. There was a statute passed in January 1991, so that's another example. And then Clinton several times went to either the Security Council to use military force, as in Haiti and in Bosnia. And when he couldn't get in Kosovo from the UN, then he went to NATO allies. So we have, and of course, President Obama going to military operations against Libya, first going to the Security Council and later going to NATO. So you can see that pattern. And regrettably, Congress doesn't understand, either appreciate its institutional and constitutional role, or something is going on. It's really been so passive. And as you know, once the president does something and gets away with it, they'll do it again and again until something stops it. But Congress, as of yet, hasn't been the one that should protect itself, but it's not.
Now, what do you say to the comeback, though, that once in a while, when proponents of this view even deign to acknowledge our arguments, they'll come back with, well, in the last resort, Congress, because it holds the purse strings, Congress can just withhold funds for any operation it doesn't want. So this is a whole lot of caterwauling about nothing. If they really felt strongly, they could just withhold the funds, and that would be the end of it. You don't have to argue about war powers anymore. What do we say to that?
Well, I would say the same thing. Once you take that attitude that the president can do what he likes, and then Congress can always come later and stop him, either cutting off money or doing something else. Then, if that's your theory of government, then I think any president, instead of coming to Congress for legislation, say on Affordable Care Act, just do it by executive order or some proclamation, and if Congress doesn't like it, then Congress can pass statute to repeal it, and I guess that's subject to a veto, and then you need a two-thirds in each house. So I think the Constitution is set up, when you make policy, whether domestic or national security, the authority comes from Congress, and the initiative does not come from the president putting pressure on the Congress whether it wants to stop the president. So I think it has the Constitution upside down.
Now, talk to us a little bit about the War Powers Resolution of 1973, because it's very interesting. I read an article you wrote. It might have been Presidential Studies Quarterly. I don't remember which one, but that you may have co-authored on this issue, because you're calling for repealing it because it gives the president too much power, whereas somebody like Newt Gingrich wants to repeal it because he thinks it curtails the president's power. Is there a disconnect here? Is there something incoherent in the resolution itself that could lead to such divergent views of it?
Well, I think the War Powers Resolution of 1973 is an extremely dishonest statute. And the reason I say that, Congress, particularly with the Vietnam War escalating, felt it had been left behind and was under pressure to, quote, reassert itself. And the Senate bill did do that, very narrow exceptions for what a president could do unilaterally. Otherwise, they had to come to Congress. The House never felt like you could, by statute, do anything in this area. So when the House and the Senate got to conference committee, they came up with a bill that Senator Tom Eagleton called a bastard. Namely, it came out with a little bit of the Senate, a little bit of the House, but it's incoherent. And the reason I say it's incoherent is that the first part of the statute says this bill is in keeping with the intent of the framers. That's one objective. Secondly, this will ensure collective judgment. And then when you look at the statute, it doesn't do either one, because it allows the president to use military force for up to 60, 90 days. That has nothing to do with the intent of the framers, and certainly has nothing to do with collective judgment. So it's extremely dishonest statute, pretending to be assertive and, in fact, giving away power that the framers would have been aghast at Congress authorizing presidential wars. But you're right. People look at it as either Congress giving it away too much, or the people who say it trenches upon presidential power are those who believe that the president somehow can go to war whenever he wants to. But as I mentioned early, that was never the case. From 1789 up to 1950, every president came to Congress either for a declaration or for an authorization.
Now, what do you say to the comeback that this is a whole lot of nonsense because we can find, quote-unquote, hundreds of you've heard the hundreds of times argument, probably hundreds of times.
Yeah.
Hundreds of times presidents deployed troops for this or that purpose without consulting Congress.
Well, the example is sort of chasing bandits over the border into Mexico. But any actually going to war against another country, using military force against another country, every one that you can think of, the first was an authorized war against France, that's 1798. 1812 was a declared war. Mexico, a declared war. Spanish-American declared war. World War I, World War II, declared war. Vietnam, an authorized war. The first Iraq war authorized. And in October 2002, authorized war against Iraq, and the year before, authorized war against Afghanistan. So every time you use military force, it's always been either authorization or declaration. Now, you do have Libya as a big example of never coming to Congress, and certainly Clinton, war against Kosovo, never coming to Congress. So there are some examples, but certainly less than a dozen, maybe 6 at the most.
Do you think that authorization, I mean, my understanding was that when you have a limited engagement, like, for example, the quasi-war with France, just some naval skirmishes, that some sort of congressional authorization is sufficient, but that when you're talking about going all-out war against a country, then nothing short of a declaration of war would be acceptable. And yet in the Iraq thing, it does seem like there was the Congress in effect saying that if the president decides that we need to go to war with this country, then he can go ahead and do that. Is there a problem with that constitutionally?
It is true that some people say that a declaration of war means that you're using all your capacity in the country to act against another. But I don't think that's the case. Vietnam was one of the biggest wars we've ever had, 500,000 troops, and that was authorized by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964. I think what the quasi-war was in 1798, I think they used the word quasi, not just because it was not declared, but it was a naval war. There was no authority to go on land. So I think that's the notion of the quasi-war, and it could have been done. Actually, the Supreme Court in 1800 and 1801 both times said it's up to Congress. It can either authorize or declare. And the framers knew that formal declarations were going out of style. Countries were not using declaration, they were using authorization. So I think they're equivalent. Constitutionally, you can either declare or authorize.
Okay, we're joined by Louis Fisher, author of Presidential War Power, very important book. And when we come back from this break, I want to ask him about the comment that the caller made that the Constitution was written by people who couldn't anticipate some of the foreign policy challenges we face now. How do we respond to that? All right, you're listening to the Peter Schiff Show, everybody, the gold standard in talk radio. Don't go away.
Back and forth through my mind behind a cigarette.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And the message coming from my
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America. We're sorry. We're sorry.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter, joined by Lou Fisher, author of Presidential War Power, among many other works. And we're just talking about, well, what we always talk about in this situation, which is, once again, we have presidents who are not paying attention to the Constitution. And I guess it just leaves you wondering, is there anything that can be done? Is there any wording that could restrain an ambitious leader? I mean, was there any wording that could have stopped a Caesar? I mean, are we ultimately faced with the fact that constitutions are just pieces of paper, and we, the people, are basically helpless to enforce them, and we just have to sit back and take it when the presidents do this? Is that where we are?
I hope not. The framers rejected monarchy. They rejected putting all of external affairs, foreign affairs, and war powers in the executive. That was the British model. And it was all very, very clear. And you can look at a lot of the foreign affairs powers and war powers that had been given to the king are in Article 1 for Congress. So that model lasted from 1789 to 1950, when Truman went to war in Korea using the UN. So I think what has destabilized the Constitution is these misapplied institutions. The UN was never supposed to be a substitute for Congress. The UN Participation Act of 1945 makes that clear. NATO was never supposed to be a substitute for Congress. But presidents after 1950 used that, and Congress didn't protect itself. Now, the framers expected all three branches to protect themselves, to fight off encroachments. That's what would keep the separation of powers alive and well. But Congress, from World War II on, has not protected itself, and it's not just not protecting itself, it's not protecting the constituents who send them here. It's not protecting democratic government. So that's, presidents will, of either Democrats or Republicans, will get by with whatever they can, and it's up for Congress to have some institutional people there. I think there's been a huge decline. I worked for Congress from 1970 to for 40 years, till August 2010. I certainly worked with many, many people who understood the institution and were willing to dedicate it to protect it. There are very few today, very, very few. That's the problem we have. And unless members protect their institution, we'll continue on the road we're on.
Now, what do you say to people like the one I described before we went into the break, who say that, well, these days things have changed. We've got all kinds of different threats, very different from ones that the framers could have anticipated. So, of course, we have to allow some kind of elastic interpretation of the president's war powers. Otherwise, it would just be unreasonable. What do you say to that?
Well, the framers fought in the Revolutionary War. They know all about that, and they did not adopt the British model, which is what the caller would want to do, go back to the British model of putting all external affairs in the president. There are parts in the Constitution that make it very clear that the framers understood dangers. For example, they gave Congress the authority to provide for calling forth a militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And also in Article 1, you cannot suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus unless, in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So the framers knew all about emergency power. Certainly the huge emergency, which would have been phenomenal, was 9/11. And yet, about a week after 9/11, President Bush came to Congress and he got authorization, the authorization for use of military force, AUMF. So even in the greatest emergency we've had after World War II, the smart thing to do constitutionally and politically is for the two branches to work through statutory authority, not to have the president go off half-cocked. That would be the dumbest thing to do. So whether it's an emergency or not, the president comes to Congress. President Bush would have been much better had he come to Congress after 9/11 and gotten authority for military commissions instead of doing that unilaterally. That just was a calamity. For the next 6-8 years, we've never gotten over that unilateral action. So come to Congress, get authority, and you're on the right footing, both legally and politically.
Now, my sense of the authorization for the use of military force was that it was analogous to the types of things that we saw that Congress did, authorizing Adams to use force in limited circumstances, authorizing the Barbary pirates' activities, and that it was aimed at, all right, well, these are the guilty parties, let's go out and get them. But my interpretation was I would have viewed it as an abuse to take the AUMF and justify it also as use it as a justification for a full-scale invasion of a whole country. I mean, it did seem like in the AUMF that we're going to pinpoint who the perpetrators are, we're going to go after them. My view was that the AUMF was clearly, you would have to go beyond that to justify the full-fledged invasion of a whole country. But you disagree with me on that?
No, I agree with what you said. And in fact, it's once you decide that Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan, you have that as the country you're going to go into. Then, of course, Al-Qaeda can go to Somalia, Yemen, any other place it wants to. So now it's not one country, it's as many countries as Al-Qaeda wants to go to. So you're right. I think what you said earlier about President John Adams, the country was France and Mexico. Later, we've always gone against one country, or World War II was certainly several countries. But 9/11 is certainly total new territory. It just looks like as many countries are available as Al-Qaeda wants to go to.
But we've got about just a minute left on this issue in the War Powers Resolution. They'll use words that are very important to define, like when war or hostilities. But then the question, and when war exists, then these congressional so-called limitations come into effect. But it seems to me the issue is who defines when something constitutes a war in the first place.
No, it's a perfect example to end because, as you know, in Libya, the Obama administration not only said there's no war there, there's not even hostilities, and the reason they said that because we don't have any casualties. So that means that any powerful nation could pulverize another country. And if there are no casualties by the aggressor, then there's no war and no hostilities. That's just playing games with words. Incredible kind of logic.
And that's the tricky part about trying to tie these people up with words, because they're so skilled at navigating their way out. Lou Fisher, thanks so much for taking some time with us. A pleasure talking to you.
Fun.
All right, that was my pleasure. Thank you. That was Louis Fisher, author of Presidential War Power. I strongly urge you to recommend. It's a great constitutional overview, but it's also a great history, tracing all this stuff through American history. All right, on the other side of this break, do you have to put down your fork and give up that steak? Is it killing you? Joined by Gary Taubes on the other side of this break. You listen to the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
You make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on Earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on. Call in now. 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories,
your freedom.
The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. Now, yesterday, I tune into Drudge once in a while. I mean, I want to go over, it's not my homepage, but I look at Drudge regularly just to see what's going on, what the sort of neocon right is interested in. And, we know he has non-political stuff on there, and I'm not so sure this is totally non-political, a lot of the health stuff. But it's very interesting to read this report about a study from the Harvard School of Public Health telling us that red meat is responsible for a lot of premature deaths. I want to get into that because I happen to enjoy eating red meat, and I know a lot of people who enjoy red meat and anecdotally seem to be doing pretty well. So I want to know, is this true? Is this, I mean, it's got the word Harvard on it. How could it not be true? Is there any reason to doubt it? Is the science behind it any good? Well, joining us right now to talk about that issue is the great Gary Taubes, educated at Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, which I recommend. Gary Taubes, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start off first. I would like to talk about your some of your other work, and normally I start with the general and then go to the specific. But in this case, I want to start with the specific, and then we'll get into general issues later. Of course, this report that we're reading all over the internet and the news outlets is referring to a study that probably no one has had a chance to examine just yet. I don't know. But there was a similar study about 4 or 5 years ago, I guess 2007, that you commented on. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is the Harvard group at the School of Public Health has been running these huge observational studies. What they've got is what's called a cohort of 70,000 nurses, the famous Nurses Health Study, where they asked them 30-odd years ago, 25 years ago, they asked them what they all ate. They gave them food questionnaires, and then you follow them forward for 25 years to see, how they do, what diseases they get, who lives, who dies. And then you try to make some associations between their mortality and their illnesses and what they're eating or smoking or birth control habits or whatever. And then they have a similar study with physicians, and this is called observational epidemiology. And actually, what's so frustrating about this, I had a cover story on this in the New York Times Magazine back in 2007. And I wrote the cover story, if nothing else, to sort of shame some of the health journalists in the field to at least stop covering this stuff because the science is so bad. And it wasn't as though I made up what I said in the cover story. I mean, I was quoting other epidemiologists, other public health experts saying this science is terrible and we shouldn't pay attention to it. And the fundamental reason why it's terrible is pretty simple. I mean, on one hand, all you can do with these things is when you've got an observation like this, so you've got Nurses in this case who ate more meat seemed to die more often than nurses who ate less meat. And doctors who ate more red meat died more often than doctors who ate less. And doctors who ate more processed meat, bacon and salami and bologna and whatever, hot dogs, that had the highest mortality. And then you say that means that red meat is a killer and processed meat's really a killer, and that's what these Harvard people are doing. And the first point is that there's no causal information in those associations. You could find out, it's just a point of logic that's like 8th grade science. I don't know why they don't know better, but there's literally no causal information. So what you find out is you look at like 10,000 variables, then you go, we're going to look at red meat today, and we find that the nurses who ate a lot of red meat have more diseases than the nurses who didn't, and then our assumption is that there's no any significant difference between these nurses. The nurses who choose to be vegetarians in effect, and the nurses who don't, or the doctors who choose to be vegetarians and the doctors who don't, that the only difference between these people is the amount of meat they eat. And one friend of mine a few years ago when a similar study came out said it's like they're comparing Berkeley vegetarians who eat at Alice Waters' restaurant Chez Panisse once a week after yoga practice to redneck truck drivers from West Virginia whose idea of a night out is Denny's, and then saying the difference in their health status is caused by the meat consumption. There are a lot of factors. Over the last 30 years, in effect, what you're doing is people who avoided red meat were health-conscious people, and people who avoided, bacon and hot dogs and bologna, et cetera, were health-conscious people. We've been hearing since the 60s that red meat may cause colon cancer. My mother was always afraid of that back in the 60s and 70s, and that, the nitrates in processed meats will kill you. So health-conscious people avoided red meat. We have a whole generation now that's grown up avoiding red meat. And people who didn't avoid red meat and who didn't avoid hot dogs and didn't avoid bologna were people who weren't health-conscious. They just didn't have...
Yeah, I was going to say that's a very interesting point. That maybe the causality is in reverse. That like for example, the university cartel is always trying to encourage people to believe that if you get a college degree, you're going to earn an extra $1 million over the course of your life, and they want you to believe that the causation goes that way. That they get the degree, that earns you the dough. But it's more likely that people who are ambitious enough to earn that extra money are the ones who are going to go to college in the first place.
And that's always the case. And what's fascinating about this is you read the philosophy of science and the great scientists over the centuries, and they're always talking about the fundamental job of science is to determine cause and effect. From what observations like this give you is they give you associations. They say, people with college degrees make more money. They say people who eat more red meat have more disease, and that's an association. The fundamental job of the scientist is now to determine cause and effect. How do you do that? You do it in an experiment. You could find Francis Bacon talking about this 400 years ago, and Claude Bernard talking about this 150 years ago, and Rudolf Virchow, the great German pathologist, writing essays on what you do is you do an experiment. So they've done experiments to test this meat-eating hypothesis, and the experiments unfortunately come out the other way. And one of the things I was pointing out in this 2007 New York Times Magazine article was this Harvard group had done this before. They've had a series of pronouncements about diseases and pharmaceuticals, hormone replacement therapy will prevent heart disease in women. So then the government spends $500 million to do a test, and lo and behold, you find that hormone replacement therapy seems to increase heart disease risk in women. Vitamin E, antioxidants prevent cancer, so they do a test, a huge clinical trial and experiment, and they find the opposite. And in this case, one of the things that got me into this field was that there have actually been randomized controlled trials where they take overweight and obese people and they randomize them into two groups. These are experiments, because now there are no behavioral differences between your subjects. When you're looking at these observations, like I said, you could assume that, meat eating or not meat eating goes along with a whole other host of behaviors. In effect, you're using meat eating and processed meat eating is what these researchers would call a marker for people who are not health conscious, who are either too ignorant to be health conscious or can't afford to be health conscious. Or
hang on just one second. I'm sorry to have to
care.
cut you off in the middle of this example, but we are coming up on a break with the bumper music tells us. So everybody stick around. Gary Taub's Smashing Myths here on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. Don't go away.
Life is the more you get from life, so go on and give. Don't count the cost.
The Peter Schiff Show.
The less you give to life, is the less you're gonna get from life.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America.
We're sorry.
We're sorry.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter, joined by Gary Taubes, author of Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. Gary, I'm so sorry I had to cut you off in the middle of setting up your example, but can you jump right back into that?
Okay, well, basically what I was saying is that when you do an observational study like the Harvard people have been reporting, you choose something you want to look at, like meat eating, and then you make the assumption that that's not associated with other behaviors that we consider unhealthy in our society. And you just look at their data, and it's clear there is. Meat eaters smoke more, they exercise less. If these people bother to look at socioeconomic status, which they didn't, they'd actually find out that they tend to be poor. They probably do a lot of things that they don't measure, like they probably eat more sugar and more sweets and more desserts and drink more beer and, have other unhealthy behaviors. And then you ignore all that. I mean, they talk about correcting for some of this, but you can't correct for what you haven't measured and don't know. And they come out with this conclusion that meat eating is bad for you because meat eaters die a little more often than non-meat eaters. Now, the way to get around all those problems and what you're supposed to do in science, and this is what good scientists have been saying for hundreds of years, is you do an experiment instead of an observation. So now we take a few hundred people and we randomize them into two groups so that we get rid of all these behavioral issues because we put them in different groups at random. And then we set one group to eating, mostly meat diet, which is what, the colloquially known as the Atkins diet. And the other group is put to eating a healthy diet, and even calorie restricted. So you're eating, low fat, more fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And when you do those experiments, the people in the Atkins diet come out healthier. This is one of the great shocks to the medical community, and this was led to a cover story I had in the New York Times Magazine back in 2002. And it's unfortunate, but it always turns out to be the case. They have better risk factors for heart disease, diabetes, and they lose more weight. And so the assumption of these Harvard people is that these experiments only tell you what happens over a year or two. And if you would run them out for 10 or 20 or 30 years, you would find what they're seeing, which is that suddenly somehow this flip-flops, and what turns out to be a healthy behavior over a couple years becomes an unhealthy behavior over 20 or 30 years. And maybe that's true, but they really have no way. That's just what they would like to be true, because if it isn't true, it means that once again their studies have come up with the wrong answer, and that they're working with a fundamentally flawed tool.
Gary, we've got a call that seems relevant to the discussion, so let's go to Greg in Wilmington, Delaware. Greg, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey, I have a comment, then I want to ask a separate question. I work in demography for a business, and North Dakota has the longest life longevity, and I would be quite shocked if they're not heavy meat eaters, and I doubt if they go to health clubs and that sort of thing. So I don't know if the study looked at that.
Well, this is, it's interesting. I mean, the point is, I would be shocked if they weren't heavy meat eaters also, but you can't really tell, if they have maybe there's less pollution in North Dakota, maybe there's less stress, maybe hardy European stock ends up living in North Dakota, and less hardy stock ends up going to southern climates where they're warm. You never know. There's always almost an infinite number of variables that can explain these associations. And again, that's why you do these observations. That's why you do the experiments. And
right.
the problem with this
can
Harvard
I ask
group,
a sort of separate, unrelated question?
Sure.
Here's a study I'd like to see. it seems like every time I listen to somebody who it believes in or doesn't believe in global warming or abortion or this or that, that if you can tell me what a person thinks about three things, I'll be able to tell you what they believe other things. Like I would safe to say the people who believe in global warming are overwhelmingly liberal and the people who don't are overwhelmingly conservative. Have you ever seen a study like that studies scientists themselves?
Not in that particular venue, no, but that wouldn't be my area of expertise. For that, you would need a sociologist of science more than a journalist like myself. It wouldn't surprise me. Let me put it, one of the things that's happened over the years, I started off with a completely open mind as a kind of investigative science health journalist in the 1990s, looking at subjects in public health, and I got into these subjects because some of my friends in the physics community knew I was interested in what they call pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't so, and said, if you're interested in this bad science, pathological science, you should look at some of the public health stuff. And when I did, you just find it's terrible. And there's a lot of themes that come up that are repeated in other fields where, when you have researchers coming to conclusions about facts without a consensus or simply not being able to do experiments. And one of the fundamental problems with the global warming science is we've only got one Earth. You can't do a randomized control experiment, so you have to speculate from your observations and hope that they're right. And so these are, it's a fuzzy area where science starts to fail us. And then we have to go into these other methods of establishing knowledge, and we don't know how reliable they are. The interesting thing, bringing it back to the meat-eating study in this Harvard School of Public Health, is we know time and time again this particular group, this particular research group they're at Harvard, they have a great name, but they've been wrong. Well, when I did the 2007 Times Magazine story, I couldn't find a single instance in which they had speculated to a cause and effect that had then been checked in experiment and turned out to agree with their speculation. So their batting average up until today has been about 0.00. Luckily, they publish so many papers. They publish, several papers a week virtually out of these experiments, that they've got to be right on some of them, from the stop clock principle.
All right, Greg, thanks for the call. Gary, I want to know before you continue, would I be able to keep you an extra 5 minutes into the next segment? Can you spare the time?
Yeah, I'm hoping that my 3-year-old hasn't wandered off, but
I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. In fact, let's jump over to. We've got about 3 minutes to the break. Let's go to Tony in Toronto. Tony, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, gentlemen. If I understand it correctly, your guest said that miscarriages are caused by people that eat meat. Is that what you said at the beginning?
I don't think so.
The Harvard study, a group at Harvard came out with the article a couple days ago. It was all over the press yesterday, saying that meat eating is associated with a higher risk of disease and a risk of dying prematurely, and the implication was we should all cut way back on our meat eating, and I was explaining that.
First of all, God ordained eating meat, okay? That is biblical. I don't want to get into it. So if he ordained eating meat, it's not the meat that's the problem. It's what you vaccinate your cows with or your beef with, and also what you vaccinate people with, okay? Stay away from vaccinations. Okay, all kinds of vaccinations. There's not one vaccination that is healthy. As a matter of fact, you talk about science. Show me any scientific proof that vaccination is profitable. There is none.
All right, Tony, thanks for the call. Any comment on that, Gary?
Well, again, it just shows you how complicated these issues are. For all we know, meat eaters get vaccinated less than non-meat eaters.
Yeah,
or vice versa. And that's why you have to do experiments.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it almost sounded like the caller thought you were siding with the Harvard study. I think the point of having you here is to tell us what's wrong with it. What I want to ask you about, now, as the host, I get to ask things that I'm interested in, and I get to get them answered by the experts who I might have trouble reaching, but now I got them on the show. I get to ask them what they want. So when we come back, what I want you to tell us about is the thesis of your earlier book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, because I want to know when you're faced with people who basically believe that diet is just a matter of arithmetic. And it's because it seems superficially plausible, right? It's just a matter of numbers, that if I input X number of calories into my body, but then I expend Y calories in the course of my exercise, then that's good. If Y is greater than X, then I'm going to lose weight. How could it not be a matter of simple arithmetic? That's what we're going to talk to Gary Taubes about after this break here on the Peter Schiff Show. And feel free to join in the conversation because we got a lot more stuff to talk about after we finish with Gary. I want to hear from you guys. What's on your mind? That's 855-4-SCHIFF is the number, 855-472-4433. You're listening to the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio. The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods, in for Peter, joined by Gary Taubes, author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. Check those out. Gary, my question for you, my host question that I want to ask now that you're on, is for you just to explain the basic gist of your Good Calories, Bad Calories thesis, because as I spelled it out before the break, we can at least understand why somebody might think on a superficial level that this is really just a matter of counting calories. I eat a certain amount of calories, and if I can burn more than that, then it's just a matter of numbers, and I'm going to lose weight, and I should just be focused obsessively on this magic number. What's wrong with that thinking?
Virtually everything.
Okay.
And this is the way we've thought about obesity in this country since the 1950s. What's interesting is prior to the Second World War, European researchers who did far and away the best medical research at the time had a different theory of obesity that vanished with the war, unfortunately. So what we do in this country is we turn into what they call an energy balance problem. As you put it, take in more calories than you expend, you're going to get fat. That's kind of true, except that you could come up with examples like growing children who take in more calories than they expend and don't get fat, they just grow. Or boys going through puberty take in more calories than they expend and they actually lose fat and gain muscle. Girls gain fat. So the question is, what do the calories have to do with it? And the argument that this pre-World War II argument that I've tried to resuscitate is that, you've got two ways of looking at it. One is what food brings to you is the calories, and it's all about energy. And the other is the different nutrients in the diet have dramatically different effects on hormone levels, and indeed on specific hormones that are actually known to cause regulate the accumulation of fat in the fat tissue. And the one in particular is insulin, which has been known since the early 1960s to be the hormone that regulates fat accumulation. So if you just say, instead of I'm no longer interested in the energy in these foods, I'm interested in their effect on the hormonal regulation of fat tissue, which is how the Europeans would have described, then now you've got a different theory and you've got a different cause, because the hormone that stimulates fat accumulation is insulin, and the hormone the nutrient that stimulates insulin, for all intents and purposes, is carbohydrates. So now we've got we've got an alternative hypothesis. One says it's all about how much we eat and exercise. The other one says it's actually about the carbohydrate content of the diet and that its effect on insulin. And specific carbohydrates, refined grains and sugars in particular, are unique in their ability to elevate insulin levels in the short term with the refined grains and in the long term with sugars. And when you elevate your insulin levels, you basically trap fat in your fat tissue and make it accumulate there. And add to this is, until the 1960s, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates got you fat, made you fat. This was something every woman believed. Bread, pasta, potatoes, sweets were things you simply didn't eat if you wanted to remain lean after your 20s. In your 20s you can eat anything. But and what we did is, because we got obsessed with this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease, We put the whole nation on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. These foods that used to be considered uniquely fattening, and that the biochemistry and physiology of fat accumulation would tell you are uniquely fattening, became the staples of our diet. The base of the food guide pyramid, something we're supposed to eat, 6, 11 servings a day. And one of the reasons this anti-meat movement and pseudoscience is so troublesome is because for people who are obese and overweight, if you want to get rid of the carbohydrates, if they really are fattening, as I would argue they are, the best way to do it, the most efficient way to bring your insulin levels down, mobilize fat from your fat tissue and oxidize it, which is what it's there for, is to eat animal products. And there's no ethical or moral judgments being made here about this. It's just, if you pay attention to the laboratory science and the experimental science, it tells you that, that the way to avoid obesity and type 2 diabetes and the way to reverse it, if you've already got it, is to eat, unfortunately, a diet that's rich in animal products and poor in carbohydrates. And that's the argument I've been making, and it's a difficult one to make in this day and age.
Well, it certainly is. In fact, even when you just talk about something like the Primal Blueprint, I get all kinds of people encouraging me about it, and then I get a sliver of vegetarians who don't just say to me, well, there's a problem with that. I just get abuse and I'm an idiot and whatever. So people, it's almost like they have more invested in what they eat than in their religious beliefs. Like, I mean, it's held with that type of conviction.
It is a religion in and of itself, yeah. I mean, it goes along with religious beliefs, and I can certainly understand the idea. Mark Bittman has been blogging in the Opinionator column in the Times about all the reasons why we shouldn't eat meat, and they're all very good reasons, but the idea that you'll be healthier by avoiding it is based on bad science, and that's just unfortunate. And you could say that the verdict is still out, and that really good science has to be done. And in fact, one of the things I've done with some colleagues is started a not-for-profit to fund the kind of science that really has the kind of experimental science that's necessary to nail this down. But the kind of stuff, to use the kind of stuff that the Harvard group just published as fodder, is just to make, there's a line I always liked from the great philosopher of science, Thomas Merton, that science should never be the handmaiden of politics or religion, and that's what it becomes when you use this kind of pseudo, observational studies to argue that meat eating is bad for us. So we shouldn't eat it because you don't believe we should abuse animals or they should die for our pleasure, our culinary pleasures, and then you evoke this bad science to support it, and that's what I'm trying to curb.
Gary, very quickly, is there a place online where people can find you? Do you have a website?
I do have a website, www.garytaubes.com. I am notoriously lax in blogging. So, for instance, I should have blogged about this meat study. Instead, I'm talking to you about it.
Well, sometimes that's the easier way to go. So GaryTaubes.com. Thanks so much for taking the time with us today. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Take care.
All right, Gary Taubes, everybody. Check out his website and his books. Very important stuff. We've got a few minutes before the break. I've got some calls here. Before I take those calls, I hope you guys will continue to be patient here because there is something I want to make sure I get to before we conclude today, because I've had people email about this. I've got people over at my Facebook page talking about this. And you should follow me on Facebook, by the way, where I am on, not as Tom Woods. That's my personal site page where I put my pictures of the kids and whatever. I'm on Facebook as Thomas E. Woods Jr. So Facebook.com/Thomas E. Woods. You can join the conversation over there. And people are asking me to say something about this new propaganda being put out by the Federal Reserve System where they want to teach kids in grades, well, I don't know, I guess through all the grades, but primarily the 8th grade through high school kids. They want to give them this lesson plan that, well, here it is. The Constitution of the United States outlines the basic principles of the U.S. government. This lesson focuses on the express and implied powers of Congress and the power of the Supreme Court to declare whether a law is unconstitutional. And then they go on to talk about McCulloch versus Maryland and the constitutionality of a central bank. Students also review the express powers of Congress identified in the Constitution and analyze how Congress implements the necessary and proper (elastic) clause to enact its expressed powers. Finally, students use their knowledge of McCulloch versus Maryland and the necessary and proper clause to consider the constitutionality of the Federal Reserve System. So that's in their course outline. And so obviously we know how this is going to come out, that the ability to create a central bank is an implied power in the Constitution, and it comes out of the necessary and proper clause, which says that the Congress will have those powers necessary and proper to carry into execution the expressly delegated powers of the Constitution. And it's revealing that this clause is referred to in this course outline as the elastic clause. Well, there is no elastic clause in the Constitution. There was a proposal for one at the Constitutional Convention by a guy named Gunning Bedford that Congress should simply have a plenary legislative authority, and that was just completely overruled. The necessary and proper clause means that when the Constitution says that the federal government has the power to erect needful buildings, for example, that also means it has the power to purchase lumber and to hire laborers to build the buildings and things like that, things that are obviously related to the power in question. But there's nothing that the federal government is doing that strictly requires a central bank. So to say simply that, well, of course it's covered, and then to point to McCulloch versus Maryland without pointing out, as I'm sure they won't, that James Madison was dead set against this decision, denounced the decision. Spencer Roane in Virginia, the great jurist there, who would have been Chief Justice if Adams hadn't appointed Marshall in the waning hours of his presidency, Jefferson would have appointed Spencer Roane, who wrote a series of articles absolutely decimating the decision, basically saying that John Marshall was a liar, that he was putting forth a view of the Constitution that he knew was false because he was at the ratifying convention in Richmond. He knows that wasn't how it was spun to the people, and that's what matters. What matters is how did the people understand the Constitution? How was it explained to them in their ratifying conventions? That's what matters. But in terms of the constitutionality of the Fed, this is just a home run against. And what I'll do, just for the sake of time, is refer you guys to a page on my site where I take on this question sort of indirectly because I wasn't really dealing with the Fed directly, but you can extrapolate from this to the Fed. And on this page, I give you links that will give you an in-depth constitutional overview of the powers of the federal government over money and where the Fed fits into that. And that's tomwoods.com/dollar. And that's where I explain the constitutionality of various things the federal government has done with regard to money, and you'll get all the resources you need to refute this. But it's just dead wrong that the idea that the power to regulate money or coin money means that you can establish a central bank to print money and debase the money. That is not what these terms mean. So check out tomwoods.com/dollar. Stick around here on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. We're coming right back.
Never woke up, I woke up. There's a party in my mind.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And I hope it never stops.
Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. It's our final segment. Just a reminder, I will be at Nullify Now, Philadelphia, with all the cool people on March 31st. I hope you'll join me there, as well as at Drake Law School in Des Moines, Iowa, April 4th. And I thought it was going to be Indianapolis, but turns out it's at Purdue University on April 21st, and hoping to add more events. I've got a totally wide open May right now, but that's what I've got going so far. So check out tomwoods.com for details about those and for my blogging and everything else. All right, we've got a few calls here on this last segment, so let's keep the questions super precise so I can get to all of them. Let's go to the extremely patient Robert in, it looks like San Francisco. Robert, welcome to the program.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
I have a question. I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on the guest you had first on today. He mentioned the militia power to execute the laws of the Union. And that's something that I've thought about a lot, and I've done research and study into. And we don't really have militias anymore.
Right.
And so I was just curious what your thoughts are on that. And when I say militias, I'm not talking about these private groups that people would put together, as well intended as they may or may not be.
Right. You mean the idea that everybody belongs to it?
Structure.
Yeah.
Yes, the actual constitutional structure. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, or if you've given into much research into that subject.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the call, Robert. What they sometimes try to say is that the militia has given way to the State National Guard, and that the State National Guard is the substitute now for the traditional militia. But in the traditional militia, it was basically understood that everybody would be basically a decent shot, and everybody could be called out for the defense of the state when necessary, and that this would prevent. This would mean you wouldn't need to have a standing army, which a small R Republican theory was very wary of. I think ultimately, if you were to have a freer society with less of a central government, it would be sensible to revive something like that, just because the central government has shown that it can't be trusted with anything, that every single policy you assign to it, it warps, it expands beyond the original definition, it gets you into... It causes all kinds of mischief everywhere, everything it touches. So the more we can keep in the hands of the people, I say the better. Okay, let's head over to Nate in East Lansing, Michigan. Nate, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I just want to say real quick, you are the most clear, concise, and persuasive arguer I've ever heard, and I love watching your speeches online and everything.
Thank you.
But I guess I have two quick questions. Number one, the Primal Diet. Have you been working out at all with that? I know that you've lost a decent amount of weight. Have you done any sort of exercise, or is it just really the food you've been eating?
Well, I'll answer them both in a row. So give me your second one too, please.
The second one is: are there any good, real concise Austrian theory of the business cycle documentaries out there? Because I scour the internet and I kind of find bits and pieces, but nothing really put together.
Okay, very good. All right, thanks for those questions, Nate. Very quickly, I'm doing this Primal Blueprint thing, which is it's more than just what you eat. It's a whole sort of lifestyle change, and I've lost weight and I've been feeling very good, but I have not, to my eternal shame, been able to incorporate much workout into this. Which it's not calling for anything especially dramatic or difficult, but just that my time has been very precious and dear lately. But I do intend to do this. I hope my wife is listening. I do intend to do that. I'm all ready to do it. I'm going to incorporate it into my regimen, but so far I've had the results even without that. And the second thing is there a good documentary or just a good quick overview video of the Austrian theory of the business cycle? I mean, there are a lot of long-winded ones, a lot of long ones, but in terms of a short little overview, one isn't coming to mind. But if anybody knows of one, send it to me at tomwoods.com on my contact page, and I'll post it in a blog post over there so that people can look at it. I'm in the process of putting together a documentary based on my book Meltdown from 2009, which was I had a New York Times bestseller on the subject of what caused the financial crisis, and it was not the usual. It was not the Paul Krugman explanation. It was the Austrian explanation. So we're doing a documentary based on this, and a little bit of that is going to have some animation that kind of tries to help people visualize the Austrian business cycle theory. Maybe people will be able to cut out that part of it and use that on YouTube when that's ready, we hope by the end of this year. Okay, let's see. Let's go to Michael in, looks like Los Angeles, California. Michael, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show. Do we still have Michael? Okay, we may not have Michael anymore, but we have his question. We got his question out of him. That's the thing that matters. I'm going to answer his question. The question is college the best choice right now? It's a tough question for young people in this sort of economy. Should I do this? Should I invest all this time and money, given that we're talking about an enormous amount of time and also the opportunity cost? Several years, 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 years devoted to college that I'm not devoted to earning an income. It's a very good question, because then I go through all this and I have no guarantee of having a job on the other side of things. I mean, I think back to the 1990s. I graduated college in 94, and I think back to those days. No one even thought about this. No one even thought about this. Just thought you go through college and there are a lot of job offers waiting for you on the other side. So I just grew up in a totally, totally different environment. So it's hard for me to answer this question. What I will say is I recommend you check out what Gary North has written about this. Gary North has a very interesting report that I've read on low-cost colleges, how to get through college in a way that will save you a bundle. He's basically saying, here's how you can get through college for $15,000 for the entire degree. And this sounds like this has got to be some kind of scam. What's Woods pulling here on us here on the Peter Schiff Show? But honest to goodness, that you can do it through distance learning. You can get an accredited degree, and it's just as good as any other degree you're going to get from any of these other places. And if you want to go to grad school, then go ahead and go to grad school after that, and you can go to a prominent grad school. And that's what matters, is if you really need to be if you're in a field where the prestige of your university actually counts, they always care about what's the university where you got your terminal degree or the last degree. That's what they care about, your grad school. They don't care so much about your undergrad. In fact, to the contrary, if you go to a really, really good undergrad school and then you go to sort of an okay graduate school, this could actually work against you because they would wondering, well, what are you doing? How come there's a Harvard kid in this low-ranked grad program? What happened to him? So that would actually be bad for you. It's much better to start from a modest school and work your way up. But he gives some very good suggestions. So what I would do is, he used to have a website on this. I don't see it anymore. Just go to Google, type in Gary North and lowest cost colleges or Gary North College, and he'll give you some good advice on that. And then you can decide if this is really for you. Basically, in this economy, there is no substitute for entrepreneurial judgment and spotting opportunities. And he's very, very good at spotting opportunities for people. So I always recommend reading him for those insights. All right, everybody, we're out of time. But hope you've enjoyed these past 2 hours where we've talked about presidential war powers. And you can eat that steak after all. It turns out that this is a correlation that does not imply causation. So why am I keeping you on the air? You got to be going firing up the grill. Eat that steak. All right, my thanks to my guests, Gary Taubes and Louis Fisher. Check me out at TomWoods.com. And thanks for listening to the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. Have a great day.